Hi everyone. Thanks for being here. Today I want to tell a story about Korea's economy, and I promise it's not just a bunch of boring numbers. Think of the economy like a huge ship. From far away, the ship looks shiny and powerful. But if you walk on deck, you might notice some parts that are cracked or rusty. Our goal is to look at both, the shiny parts and the hidden problems. First, the shiny part. Korea's growth over the last few decades is honestly one of the fastest success stories in modern economic history. One simple way economists measure this is GDP per capita, basically how much economic output there is per person. The World Bank has a category called high-income country. A country is usually treated as high income when its GDP per capita is more than about 45% of the US level. Korea crossed that line in 1995. Back then, Korea's GDP per capita was around 49% of the US level. By 2020, it was about 68.5%. So Korea didn't just escape poverty. It joined a relatively small club of high-income economies. But here's the important point for today. When a country reaches this level, the challenge changes. It's not only about growing bigger anymore. It becomes about growing better. People start caring more about things like stable jobs, fair wages, housing costs, and quality of life. So yes, Korea's report card looks amazing at first glance. But if we only look at the headline numbers, we miss the hard questions. That's why we're going to dig into what's hiding behind the indicators. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, here's the roadmap for today, so you always know where we are. We'll go in 4 steps. First, we'll look at Korea's macro indicators, the big national numbers like growth, unemployment, and trade. And we'll talk about why those numbers can sometimes look better than what people actually feel in daily life. Second, we'll talk about one of the biggest structural problems in Korea, a dual structure in the economy and labor market. In simple terms, it means life can be totally different depending on whether you work for a big company or a small one, and whether your job is stable or not. Third, we'll ask, what is the government doing about inequality? We'll see that Korea's tax and welfare system doesn't reduce poverty and inequality as much as it does in many other OECD countries. And that connects to a bigger issue, whether people can actually build stable lives. Finally, we'll introduce a concept called the Latin trap. Don't worry, it's not a geography quiz. It's a way to describe how an economy can get stuck, looking strong on the outside, but struggling inside because of debt, weak domestic demand, and social conflict. We'll finish by talking about what Korea would need to do to escape that trap. So that's the plan. Now let's start with the big numbers. And then we'll ask the more uncomfortable question. What do those numbers leave out? If you only look at the national statistics, Korea looks like the perfect student in the OECD. Think about it. Growth is decent, unemployment is low, and inflation is also low. And Korea's trade performance is especially strong. The current account surplus, basically how much money the country earns from the rest of the world compared to what it spends. It was about 4.8% of GDP. The OECD average is only around 0.39%. So yes, Korean companies are really competitive internationally. But here's the catch. Macro numbers are averages. They don't automatically tell you what life feels like for real people. For example, Korea's unemployment rate looks low, partly because of how employment is counted. Some people who lose jobs don't show up as unemployed because they stop actively looking for work or they move into small self-employment, like running a tiny shop or doing delivery work. On paper, they're employed. In real life, their income can be unstable and their work can be insecure. So the point is, the economy can look great from far away, but people can still feel stressed, stuck, or anxious. And it's not just about jobs. Next, we'll look at inflation. Because Korea's official inflation rate looks low, but a lot of people feel the opposite when they pay for housing in daily life. Let's go to the next slide. So here's a question a lot of people ask. If inflation is only around 1%, why does everything feel so expensive? A big reason is that the official inflation number doesn't always match what people actually pay, especially for housing. Different countries calculate inflation differently. In Korea, the Consumer Price Index gives a relatively small weight to the cost of living in a home you own, what economists call owner-occupied housing costs. In everyday terms, it means the official basket of prices may not fully capture how painful housing costs feel. Some experts say that if Korea calculated housing costs more like the US, and if it reflected things like jeonse prices and the real opportunity cost of housing, then inflation could look about 2.3 percentage points higher than what's officially announced. Now add another stress factor: debt. A lot of households borrowed heavily, especially related to housing. One way to see the pressure is TSR, which is basically how much of your income goes to repaying debt. In Korea, the TSR is around 12.4%, which is higher than in the US or Japan. So even if the official inflation rate looks calm, Many households feel squeezed because a big chunk of their income is swallowed by rent, housing-related costs, and loan payments. That means people have less money left to spend on everything else. So domestic demand stays weak. Okay, so now we've seen the basic idea. The national report card can look great, but daily life can still feel hard. Next, we'll talk about the deeper reason why. The benefits of growth are not being shared evenly. Let's move on. Now we're getting to a key idea for understanding Korea. Growth exists, but the winners and non-winners are very clearly separated. Let's look at this 2017 manufacturing example. Large firms in Korea earned about 57.4% of total operating profits. That's huge, more than half. But here's the surprising part. Those same large firms provided only about 27.1% of the jobs. To see why this matters, compare it to the OECD pattern. In many OECD countries, when large firms get around 62% of profits, they usually provide around 39.1% of employment. So big companies not only make money, they also hire a lot of people. In Korea, big companies are making a lot of money, but they're not creating jobs at the same level. This is what people mean by jobless growth. The economy can grow, exports can rise, profits can jump. And yet many ordinary people don't feel it in their paycheck or their job opportunities. You can think of it like this. The water is flowing into a big tank, but the pipes that should carry water to everyone else are clogged. So the big question is, why is the pipe clogged? What's stopping profits and growth from turning into jobs and better wages for more people? That's what we'll explore next. Polarization doesn't just happen between rich and poor. It also happens between industries. Since the 1990s, Korea's IT sector has been a superstar. It became more productive, it exported more, and it pulled the economy forward. At the same time, a lot of non-IT industries, especially those connected to everyday domestic life, they didn't keep up. Think of things like small manufacturers, local services, and businesses that mainly sell inside Korea. Many of these sectors have lower productivity and weaker competitiveness, and manufacturing itself has changed. A long time ago, if a factory produced more, it usually hired more people. But today, when production increases, it often happens through automation. More machines, more robots, more software. Companies can raise output without adding many new jobs. So we end up with a situation where some sectors run very fast, especially export-focused, high-tech sectors, while the parts of the economy that provide everyday jobs and support domestic demand move slowly or even shrink. This matters because most people live in the everyday economy. If those sectors are weak, wages are weak, and job quality is weak, then people naturally feel anxious, even if export numbers look impressive. Next, we'll zoom in even more and look at something Koreans talk about all the time: how different your life can be depending on what kind of company you work for. When people talk about job inequality in Korea, they often say regular versus non-regular workers. That's real. But there's another line that can be even more important: big companies versus small and medium enterprises, or SME. Here's what that means in real life. In some cases, a non-regular worker at a large company can earn more and get better benefits than a regular worker at an SME. Benefits include things like social insurance, pension, health insurance, employment insurance, basically the things that make life more stable. And the wage gap is huge. According to the stats here, the income of a regular SME worker is only about 48% of the income of a regular worker at a large firm. So your company size can feel like an invisible rank badge. It changes your salary, your benefits, your career path, and even how secure you feel about the future. This is why so many young people in Korea become extremely focused on getting into large firms or the public sector. It's not because they love those companies so much. It's because the gap is so big that it feels like a completely different life. But there's a cost. If everyone is chasing a small number of good jobs, the whole labor market becomes distorted, competition becomes intense, and many people end up stuck in unstable work. Next, we'll look at one more key symptom. Even when productivity rises, wages don't rise the same way anymore. This slide is about a really important and honestly frustrating trend. Productivity means how much value workers produce in an hour or a day. If productivity goes up, we might expect wages to go up too, right? Because if the pie gets bigger, workers should get a bigger slice. In the past, that was closer to true. When workers produced more, wages tended to rise. But since the mid-1990s, in many countries, including Korea, these two lines started to split. Productivity keeps going up, but real wages don't rise as much. Economists often describe this as a fall in labor's share of income, meaning a smaller portion of the total income goes to workers, and a larger portion goes to profits. This also connects to inequality. When wages become more unequal, the average wage can look okay because very high earners pull it up. But the median wage, which is what a typical worker earns, can be much lower. That's why people say things like, "I'm working hard, but I'm not getting ahead." It's not just a mood or a complaint. It matches the data. So if growth and productivity aren't turning into better pay for many people, what happens next? People delay marriage, delay having children, feel less secure, and the whole society starts to feel unstable. That's exactly what Part 3 is about. How economic imbalance turns into social problems. Now let's talk about development, but not just in the money sense. You may have heard of the HDI, the Human Development Index. It includes things like health, education, and income. Korea does very well on that, ranking around 19th in the world. That makes sense. Korea has good healthcare, high education levels, and a high-income economy. But there's another version called IHDI, the Inequality Adjusted Human Development Index. It basically asks, okay, but how evenly are those good things shared? When we adjust for inequality, Korea drops to about 22nd. That drop might sound small, but the meaning is important. Inequality is pulling down real quality of life. In other words, Korea can look very advanced on the surface, but inside, many people experience intense competition, big gaps, and a lot of pressure. And one really sensitive area is education. Education is supposed to help people move upward, like a ladder. But if education becomes too expensive or too dependent on family background, it can turn into the opposite, a system that keeps people in their social class. So the question becomes, if inequality is hurting people's lives, shouldn't the government reduce it through taxes and welfare? That's exactly what the next slide is about. This slide is basically asking, where is the government in all of this? Here's the surprising part. Before the government steps in with taxes and welfare, Korea's market income poverty rate. So poverty based only on what people earn in the market. It is not terrible compared to some European countries like France or Germany, so the market itself isn't the whole story. The real shock comes after government policy. In many OECD countries, taxes and transfers reduce poverty a lot, sometimes close to cutting it in half. But in Korea, the poverty rate improves by only about 2.2 percentage points after taxes and transfers. That's tiny. So the paradox is this. Korea's poverty problem isn't only about people not earning enough. It's also about the tax and welfare system not doing enough to protect people. When redistribution is weak, individuals and families have to handle most risks by themselves. Losing a job, getting sick, paying for housing, paying for education, caring for kids or parents. And when people feel like they have to carry all those risks alone, they make cautious choices. They avoid big life decisions, like marriage and having children. That's why the next slide connects economics to something that sounds personal: family, childbirth, and the future of society. This slide might sound dramatic, but it's describing something very real in Korea. Every society needs reproduction, not in a biology class way, but in a social way. It means people form families, have children, raise them, and the next generation keeps society running. But in Korea, many of the biggest costs of life, housing, education, childcare, elder care, they are still carried heavily by individuals and families. So imagine you're in your 20s or early 30s. You have job uncertainty, expensive housing, and maybe debt. If the social safety net is weak, then getting married or having a child can feel less like a happy step and more like taking a huge financial risk. And when people feel that way, they often choose to delay or avoid those choices. That's one reason Korea has the world's lowest birth rate. This isn't about blaming young people. From their point of view, it's a rational reaction. If I can't afford it safely, I won't do it. Another issue is that the older welfare model assumed a stable male breadwinner job. But that model doesn't fit modern reality. More dual-income families, more unstable work, and more pressure on women. So this becomes bigger than personal lifestyle. It turns into a national sustainability problem. If the system makes normal life choices feel dangerous, then the system itself is in trouble. Next, we'll look at one concrete reason this happens: Korea's government spending and welfare structure. Here's a simple phrase that helps explain a lot about Korea: low burden, low welfare. Low burden means taxes and social contributions are relatively low compared to many advanced countries. Low welfare means government support, like unemployment benefits, family support, housing support, and social services. It also stays relatively small. Look at the number here. Social welfare spending is about 11.1% of GDP, roughly half the OECD average. At the same time, Korea's budget has traditionally put a bigger share into things like economic projects, roads, construction, and infrastructure, more like a developing country style of spending. That kind of spending helped during the rapid growth period, but once a country becomes high income, people usually expect the government to invest more directly in human lives. There's another detail. If a large share of workers don't pay income tax, and if the tax base is not diversified enough, it becomes hard for the government to collect stable revenue and expand welfare. So what happens? Welfare coverage can become uneven. People in large firms or the public sector often have strong benefits through their jobs. But many people in SME, non-regular jobs, or self-employment can fall into blind spots. This creates what we can call a dual welfare structure. Two Koreas living under different levels of security. And when you combine weak redistribution with a polarized labor market, the economy can get stuck in a trap. That's where the Latin trap idea comes in. Let's go to part 4 and explain it clearly. Now we're at the main concept, the Latin trap. Quick warning, this isn't about Latin language or culture. It's an economics idea, based on patterns that appeared in parts of Latin America. The basic idea is that an economy can get stuck trying to balance 3 things at the same time. 1. External balance, or PB, staying healthy in trade and external debt, basically not running into a foreign currency crisis. 2. Internal balance, or NN, keeping unemployment and inflation under control, so the domestic economy feels stable. 3. Social peace, or SP, keeping inequality, polarization, and conflict from exploding. In some Latin American cases, countries borrowed a lot to grow fast. That hurt external balance. Then they tried austerity, cutting spending and tightening the economy to fix the external side. But that often made unemployment and inequality worse, which damaged social peace. And then political instability made the economy even weaker. It became a vicious cycle. So what about Korea? On the outside, Korea looks okay. It often has a current account surplus. But inside the country, there are big stress signs. High household debt, weak domestic demand, and a labor market split into secure and insecure groups. And socially, polarization is intense. People feel the gap. And conflict can rise. So we can say Korea faces a Korean-style version of this trap. The outside looks stable, but the inside is under pressure. Next, we'll look at how Korea's path has changed over time, and why this trap is not something that appeared overnight. Let's zoom out and look at Korea's recent history, because this trap is really a combination of different phases. Before the Asian financial crisis in the late 1990s, Korea pushed investment and growth very aggressively. That helped growth, but it also created vulnerabilities, especially on the external side. That's the kind of pattern some people compare to Latin America-type risks. Then the financial crisis hit, and Korea went through a major restructuring period, often associated with the IMF program. In that phase, the country focused on stabilizing the economy, but the cost was heavy. Layoffs, insecurity, and a lot of pain for workers and families. After that, Korea recovered and became more stable. But welfare improvements often benefited people with already stable positions, like regular workers at large firms, while the labor market stayed polarized. That's why some people call it an Europe-type path. Stability for insiders, insecurity for outsiders. More recently, when growth slowed, Korea often relied on policies linked to real estate and household debt to keep the economy moving. That can temporarily boost demand, but it also increases financial risk. Here's one more important idea. Korea's current account surplus today is not always a happy surplus. Sometimes it's because domestic demand is weak. If people are spending less and imports fall, the external balance can look better, even though households are struggling. That's what is meant by a recession-driven surplus. So the surface can look stable, but underneath there can be serious pressure building up. So what do? The next slide starts the solution side. How to change the structure, not just treat symptoms. Okay, now we move from diagnosis to solutions. The first big strategy is about shifting the PB line, external balance. In plain English, Korea can't rely only on export more forever. The stronger long-term answer is to raise productivity through innovation. New technology, new industries, better ways of working. Why does productivity matter so much? Because productivity is what makes higher wages possible without losing competitiveness. If a company becomes more productive, it can pay workers more and still sell products at competitive prices internationally. That's the ideal situation. Exports are strong, but workers' paychecks also grow. But that doesn't happen automatically. Korea also needs to make it easier for workers and companies to move from old industries to new ones. That's what we mean by labor flexibility. But it shouldn't mean people get abandoned. It has to be combined with active labor market policies, training, job matching, and support so people can transition safely. So the message of this slide is, innovation is not just about cool gadgets. It's a necessary engine to create sustainable growth and to reconnect productivity growth with wage growth. Next, we'll talk about the second strategy, which is less about technology and more about society, how to reduce polarization and rebuild trust. The second strategy is the hard one, because it involves politics, negotiation, and real compromise. It's what we're calling a grand social bargain, and the goal is to shift the SP line. Social peace. What does that mean in simple terms? It means reducing the gap between insiders and outsiders. In Korea, people who work at large firms or in stable regular jobs often have much better wages and benefits. Meanwhile, many people in SME or non-regular jobs have weaker protection and more anxiety. A grand bargain means the groups who are currently better protected, like large firms and secure workers, they give up some advantages, and society uses that space to raise the floor for everyone else. Better conditions in SME, better protection for non-regular workers, and a bigger social safety net. Why is this necessary? Because without it, polarization keeps growing. And when polarization grows, trust disappears, conflict rises, and people feel the future is unsafe. And when the future feels unsafe, people stop making long-term life choices, like marriage and having children. That's why social peace is not just being nice. It's connected to whether society can continue. If Korea can't reach this kind of compromise, the country could drift into what we might call a destructive equilibrium, where the system solves its imbalance by shrinking. Fewer births, less growth, and more conflict. So the big message is, to escape the trap, Korea needs two wheels moving together: innovation to grow the pie, and compromise to share it more fairly. Now let's wrap everything up with the conclusion. Let me finish with the main takeaway. Korea has done something impressive. It climbed into the high-income group and became one of the world's leading economies. If you look only at the big numbers, Korea looks strong. But today we looked under the surface. We saw that, 1. Some indicators can hide what everyday life feels like. 2. Growth benefits are concentrated, and the labor market is split, especially by firm size and job stability. 3. Wages haven't kept up with productivity for many workers. 4. The tax and welfare system doesn't reduce poverty and inequality as strongly as many other OECD countries. 5. And when people feel they have to carry life's risks alone, housing, education, childcare, they naturally delay marriage and childbirth. That combination, external strength with internal weakness and social tension, it is what we described as a Korean-style Latin trap. So what should Korea do? Not just short-term fixes, not just temporary stimulus. Korea needs a deeper transformation. 1. Innovation and productivity growth, so the economy keeps creating real value, and so higher productivity can lead to higher wages. 2. A grand social bargain, so the country reduces polarization and builds a stronger safety net, making normal life decisions feel possible again. If Korea can move on these two tracks together, it can go beyond being just a high-income country on paper and become a society where more people feel secure and hopeful. Thanks for listening. If you have questions, especially if any terms were confusing, please ask. I'm happy to explain in simpler words.